What if China invaded Russia? Firstly, just to be clear, it is very obvious that China would not do this. It would be a terrible decision. It would be disastrous. No one is suggesting this is going to happen, we're just here to ask ourselves, what if? So let's do that. If China attempted to forcefully take over Russia, the results would lead to damage politically, economically, and there would also be military consequences as well. Right now, China doesn't have a ton of close alliances and friendships, but you know who is their closest and most powerful ally? Russia. Russia is actually China's only large and powerful ally. This means that for China, who is trying to assert themselves and show that they are a world superpower, you don't want to ruin a relationship like that. Those are the things you need to be a global superpower, and they simply cannot damage that. So, of course, in the event of China invading Russia, that entire relationship would be ruined, and China would certainly be in a worse place in terms of global politics because of it. An invasion of Russia by China would also truly cause damage to the reputation of the country, again in terms of global politics, because no country would exactly be jumping on a chance to partner up with you when you just turned against your closest ally. It's just not a good look when you're trying to build trust and confidence. This means that an invasion could jeopardize many of the current ongoing foreign policy initiatives. This includes the Belt and Road Initiative, formerly known as One Belt, One Road. If unfamiliar, this is a global infrastructure development strategy that was adopted by the Chinese government in 2013. The goal is basically to invest in almost 70 different countries and international organizations, which of course would then cause China to assume greater leadership roles when it comes to global affairs. As China rises and comes into greater power and status, they want to have these sorts of foreign policies to match. But if China were to turn on their ally and invade Russia, why would any other country trust them to be involved in this sort of infrastructure development? China would then be seen as invaders, and the $10 trillion project would fall by the wayside, and it would have all been a waste. Instead of focusing on these initiatives, everyone, especially those directly around the country, would begin arming themselves and preparing, because if they went ahead and did that, then who would know who would be next? Without the relationship of Russia, China becomes an easier target for any opposition. Russia is of great benefit to China. The two countries certainly have a mutually beneficial relationship, which is exactly why it would be foolish for China to squander that. If China invades Russia, they become a lot more susceptible to any kind of attack, whether it be from NATO or otherwise. An invasion truly wouldn't do them any kind of favors politically. When it comes to what an invasion would do economically, things really don't get any better. Presumably, the only reason I can think of why China would ever invade Russia is to have access to and secure the natural resources that exist there. But here's the flaw with this. They already have access to them. They just have to buy them from Russia, and Russia would love to just ship them right over the border from Siberia. It would make absolutely zero sense for China to instead begin a very, much more costly war with Russia and perhaps the rest of the world, instead of just paying for the resources they want access to. Like, seriously, think about it. There would be the initial cost of the invasion, then the cost of keeping the war going, then if they were somehow able to drive the Russians out, then there would be the cost of rebuilding all of the destroyed energy and transportation infrastructure that was just ruined, and then the cost of settling people there, and then they would end up just buying those resources again from the new settlers, when in the beginning, they can just purchase them from Russia and call it a day. Also, China is already getting gas from Russia via the Siberia pipeline. This little deal began in 2019, and in 2021 alone, Russia exported 16.5 billion cubic meters of gas to China, so clearly there's no issue doing business together. It really just wouldn't make any sense, but one thing is certainly clear. An invasion would cause a lot of trouble economically, which is just another thing that would get in the way of China and its path to becoming a global superpower. We talked about the effects that an invasion would have politically and economically, but what about in a military sense? The Russian military is likely to put up quite a fight if it were to ever come to that. Firstly, there's a lot of weaponry that is delivered to China from Russia. If their weapons are Russian-made, this means that Russia knows all of the details of them. This includes range, accuracy, tactics that can be utilized. It would be like having the other team's playbook. Couple this with the fact of the really advanced weaponry that Russia has that really nowhere else in the world is equal to, and you really have a recipe for disaster. I mean, it has been clear since the Cold War that Russia is technologically advanced and that they know what they're doing. It might not be the flashiest, but they have their best and brightest working on these sorts of things. Another way that China would likely suffer in the military way is that Russia would be fighting on their very large home soil. China would need time to build up their forces if they were to choose to invade, but Russia would already know this. Whether it's through informants, spying, or satellites, a surprise attack would be highly unlikely. This means that Russia would be able to prepare effectively. Russia has a far better understanding of the seasons and the terrain, and while China is highly populated, Russia is vast. China isn't small by any means, but sitting at third on the list of largest countries still puts them close to just half the size of Russia. This alone would mean that many more people and resources would be needed for an invasion to be feasible if they wanted even a fighting chance at winning. This means more money, more people, and in the end, likely more deaths. Any attempt by China to take Russia or even just Siberia would likely be catastrophic for Chinese forces. This extra preparation time would also allow Russia ample time to do things like placing traps or setting up defensive positions or planning ambushes. People would certainly argue that the amount of manpower that China has might place them on top of Russia, but that isn't necessarily true. While it does give them a bit of an upper hand, it might not be the slam dunk that some would claim it is. In this scenario, Russia doesn't need to completely wipe out the Chinese armed forces. That isn't the goal. Instead, all they need to do is either push the forces out or make it so costly that it's not worth their while. Russian troops are also likely to be more mentally prepared for war. This is because of more recent conflict and tensions, and they also have more military experience than China, and this just comes down to history. While most of this video has been talking about all of the ways China would likely lose if they were to choose to invade Russia, I think it's important to note that many people, if it came down to this scenario, would also be doubting China. I think we would underestimate their ability to adapt, their ability to create infrastructure with speed and efficiency, and it would be ridiculous for me to skip over just how technologically advanced China is. I said it about Russia, but the same is true for China as well. China has very advanced military aviation and satellite communications, which would become essential during this war. I don't think it's enough for them to claim the win, but a good fight would definitely be put up. There's also the argument of how long and withstanding Chinese civilization is as a whole. I mean, Chinese civilization has been around for thousands of years, and to do something like that, you have to be doing something right. China wouldn't just invade Russia. China is here for the long game, and that doesn't include rash decisions with little thought and a more than likely terrible outcome. If China were to invade Russia, it's likely that they would be doing it because they know something that we don't. To end off this list, we of course have to talk about the inevitable: nuclear arms. Russia is armed to the teeth with ready-to-launch nukes. This strengthens them, but it also plays into the minds of anyone who is thinking about crossing them. Are you ready for that kind of fire? Having that kind of thing at your disposal would more than definitely be used by the Russian government to help push the forces out. This is all to say that I think a win on China's side, should this scenario ever come true, would be highly unlikely. Russia would have to make a series of really terrible mistakes or have some really poor leadership in order to see that kind of outcome, but truthfully, in all likelihood, this is not a situation we will see come to fruition anytime soon.
What if China invades Ukraine first? Ukraine is currently in a very tough spot right now. Their next door neighbor, Russia, is looking very threatening and very interested in potentially invading. Currently, the Russian army, which is vastly superior to that of the Ukrainian army, has mobilized over 100,000 troops and put them in various locations along their shared border with Ukraine. This is causing the entire world to go into a bit of a panic because allowing Russia to simply take Ukraine isn't an option anymore. Ukraine has been getting closer and closer to the very powerful organization of NATO, and NATO doesn't really like it when other countries invade their friends. Considering that's what Russia is thinking about doing, NATO is also thinking about interfering and stopping them from doing that. This could escalate very quickly and could turn into a war that is far deadlier than anyone would have expected or wanted. The one positive here is that Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, has come out and said that he has no intentions of invading Russia and he is simply moving his troops around as he sees fit. Many of the other world leaders don't believe this though, and I tend to agree with them. Moving that many troops to that specific spot sends a pretty clear message and puts the rest of the world on standby. However, what if Putin is telling the truth? What if they don't have any intention of invading Ukraine and he is just simply doing as he says, moving his troops around as he sees fit? What if the world is looking at this all wrong and Russia isn't even a threat at all? What if the real threat is China? Before we go deep down this rabbit hole, I want to start off by saying that this whole question is totally theoretical and there is really no basis to believe China will be attacking Ukraine anytime soon. Russia has a deep history with Ukraine, one that spans over centuries. Most recently, we've seen Ukraine be a part of the Soviet Union, and then once the Soviet Union was dissolved, Ukraine became their own independent country. Therefore, Russian and Ukrainian culture are very similar, and there are tons of people that live in Ukraine that were initially of Russian descent. It's this history that makes Russia so invested in Ukraine and wanting them to be a part of their territory. China doesn't have any of this though. There is no deep history between China and Ukraine, and their cultures are wildly different. One could argue that Russia's potential invasion of Ukraine is personal, whereas there would be nothing personal about a Chinese invasion of Ukraine. If they were to invade such a place, it would strictly be a strategical move that they would believe would benefit their country's well-being long term. Either way, the point that I'm trying to make here is that you shouldn't start to worry about China invading Ukraine because it is extremely unlikely and frankly wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. But this is YouTube and things don't always need to make sense for us to evaluate them here. So with that being said, what if China invades Ukraine first? Well, first off, the world would probably be shocked as holy hell. Speculation of China invading Taiwan has been going on for some time now, but an invasion of Ukraine would absolutely blow everyone's minds and likely have the world in a bit of a shocked territory. While the world is in deep shock, Ukraine would definitely be going through it. We've already evaluated whether or not Ukraine would be able to handle a Russian invasion by themselves in a previous video, so if you haven't seen that, then definitely go and check it out. But basically, short answer is absolutely not. China and Russia are very comparable in military strength. China has Russia beat in personnel by a ton, but for the most part aren't quite as strong in equipment. Their navy does outdo Russia's, but not by a crazy amount. Either way, both countries are very comparable in strength, and if Ukraine was going to struggle with Russia, then they would also struggle with China. However, let's actually think about this logistically. Sure, if we compare Ukraine's military to China's military side by side, China has a massive advantage. But war doesn't just go off of only numbers. Ukraine is 5,943 kilometers away from China and literally in a different continent. If China actually was going to invade Ukraine, how would they do it? For Russia, it's as simple as crossing a border, but it's not nearly as simple for China. Sure, they have millions of troops at their disposal, but how do they get them over there? How about all of their tanks or armored vehicles? Invading Ukraine would be way harder for the Chinese because they don't have a stronghold to set up anywhere. To effectively win an invasion, they would need to set up a base of operations far closer to Ukraine or in Ukraine, which the Ukrainian people wouldn't really like too much. Therefore, even though China has a massive advantage in overall strength, geography plays a huge role in this, and it's not favoring them in this scenario. It could be possible that China gets in an agreement with Russia, and Russia allows them to move all their troops into Russia and use their country as a base of operations. This begs the question though, why isn't Russia just invading Ukraine themselves? But we're already in fantasy land right now, so let's just roll with it. If Russia allowed China to do this, then China would have a much stronger foundation and could launch a massive invasion. However, there are severe complications with this plan as well. If the rest of the world saw that China was mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops, they were mobilizing tanks and armored vehicles and other things, and they were driving them all the way through Russia to the border of Ukraine, then I can guarantee they would respond pretty fast. NATO, the alliance of countries that has publicly said they will come to Ukraine's aid, would feel even more incentive to get involved and defend the country. If Russia is allowing China to invade through them, then that means that they're very close allies, and it probably means that the war of East versus West is beginning. NATO wouldn't sit back and chill just letting them set up like this, they would start setting up as well. Before you know it, there would be millions of troops all lined up on either side of the Ukrainian border waiting for something to happen. And if this is the case, then if China were to attack, then the only thing we'd know for sure is that World War III would definitely be starting. Who would win or how it would all play out is pretty impossible to say at this point. If China didn't get to set up in Russia though and had to do this all by themselves, then I feel like Ukraine might be able to actually defend themselves. China's strongest asset is their navy, but they wouldn't really even be able to get that involved. Ukraine is connected to the Black Sea, but for China to get their ships into the Black Sea, they would need to sail them all the way around Africa, then through the Mediterranean Sea, and then into the Black Sea. This is wildly impractical, and in between them and their final destination is multiple countries that probably wouldn't want them to be doing this. So basically, the Navy is totally taken out of this equation. Probably the only thing that China could do is just bomb the crap out of a specific location in Ukraine, completely destroy it, and then fly a bunch of planes there to set up a base. But again, there are so many issues with this plan and so many infinite ways that it could go wrong that I just can't possibly see it happening. Invading Ukraine just probably isn't possible for China considering how far away it is and how many allies Ukraine has readily at their disposal. I suppose China could send a bunch of nuclear bombs over there and just do it that way, but then they wouldn't actually be invading in the first place at all, they would just be attacking, which isn't really the question. Also, if they sent a bunch of nuclear bombs over there, then that would cause massive consequences. If China just started nuking Ukraine, then that would probably be the beginning of our total nuclear annihilation of the whole planet, and that's just something that nobody needs. All in all, if China invades Ukraine first, I actually think that they're gonna lose. Now granted, if China invaded Ukraine whilst Russia also invaded Ukraine, then that is a far different story and changes literally everything about this question. We've been attacking this question assuming that Russia just sits and lets China do this, but that would actually never happen in real life. However, none of this would ever actually happen in real life. If some guy on YouTube can look at this and figure this out, then China and its military leaders definitely can as well. They would look at this for about 1 second and go, yeah, so that's not gonna work, I guess we aren't gonna do that, and then just move on. The biggest thing about this question too is motive. Russia has one that's been gnawing at them for years. China doesn't have any at all. Like, yes, obviously big countries like to get more territory, but not at the risk of losing your entire army in the process. If China is going to invade anyone, then it will probably be Taiwan, but that's a completely other different video. What if China took over the world? China is the third biggest country in the world and has the largest population on the planet. They have over 1.4 billion people living there, which is more than 3 times bigger than the United States. Whilst China may have the most people in the world, they currently do not have the largest economy on the planet. That title does still remain with the US. That being said though, over the past few decades, China's economy has grown substantially. In the year 2000, their GDP, which is probably the most important metric used by economists in determining the health of a nation's economy, was sitting at 1.2 trillion. That was good for 6th in the world at the time, but nowadays that number has risen to over 14 trillion, which firmly puts them at 2nd in the world behind the States. Economy aside, China also has one of the best militaries in the world. They're continuing to make massive investments into their military, and now they have the 3rd strongest in the world, trailing the United States and Russia. Aside from all the resources and money, there has been long-time speculation in the media that China intends to be the next major global power. Whether this manifests itself in the domination of the entire planet is unknown, but the belief that the power is shifting from the west to the east has been brewing for quite some time. Many people believe that China is the world's next superpower and within the next century will overtake the United States as having the strongest largest economy and the most global influence. With all of that being said, it's not unrealistic for people to start wondering what a China-led world might look like. How long would this potentially take? The method to how China would end up with global power, and the overall ramifications that it would have on everyone's daily life. So, without further ado, let's break down what would happen if China took over the world. Well, first we need to look at how this global takeover would actually happen if it was to transpire. It's impossible to speculate on what would happen if they took over the world if we don't know how they actually did it. For instance, taking over the world by blowing it all sky high with nuclear weapons would be very different than developing a slow chokehold over the worldwide economy. So, how would China actually take over the entire planet? Well, first off, nuclear weapons wouldn't be the way to go about it. There's currently an approximate of 14,000 nuclear weapons on the entire planet. Now, nobody knows the exact number, but people believe that China has roughly 350 of them. That's still a ton of nuclear weapons, but if China was to ever fire one of these on another country in the effort to eventually take it over, then they would most likely get completely blown up by the other thousands of nuclear weapons that the world has, and their attempt at world domination, it would be over. No, if China has any aspirations of becoming a global superpower and then taking over the world, they'll need to play the long game. Now, this is all very complicated, so I'm going to quote an article written by Hal Brands and Jake Sullivan on what they believe to be the two potential avenues China will take in obtaining global power. The article reads, "This road runs through China's home region, specifically the Western Pacific. It focuses on building regional primacy as a springboard to global power, and it looks quite familiar to the road the United States itself once traveled. The second road is very different because it seems to defy the historical laws of strategy and geopolitics. This approach focuses less on building a position of unassailable strength in the Western Pacific than on outflanking the US alliance system and force presence in that region by developing China's economic, diplomatic, and political influence on a global scale." So that was a lot. Let's break it down a little bit. The first option, which was historically attempted by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, is to basically establish an incredibly strong foothold where you're located so that you can focus on military offense rather than defense. Now, the Soviets did this by occupying some select countries, but China doesn't necessarily need to do that. However, they certainly could. If they become such a dominant player in the Western Pacific to the point where they can practically dictate the choices of their neighbor countries, then this will be enough to have a strong base of operations. This would need to extend into island nations in the Pacific and through Asia, basically meaning that most countries bordering China would need to get the okay from them before making any major political or economical decisions. This would also effectively cut any ties that their biggest competitor, the United States, would have in this area. If we think about it, the United States has done something similar to this in North America. Where would Canada be without the ongoing trade with the US? If they cut all ties to Canada, would Canada's economy be able to survive? If China was able to do this with all of their neighbors in Asia and the Pacific, then a military attack on China gets increasingly more difficult, and one could see how China's influence could then spread through Europe as well. Option number two is a little bit more underhanded than that. In the first option, it would become increasingly clear that China is distancing themselves from the West and creating a barrier, whether that be through military dominance of their neighbors or by other means. Option two basically brings the world to them. They're currently involved in the Belt Road Initiative. This is a massive infrastructural project with the intention of creating strong supply chains all throughout Eurasia. It was announced in 2013 by China and is going to bring great economical gain to China along with global influence. The West has reportedly thought this deal is a glorified way for China to take global influence away from the United States and become the center of the world. That could all be true, to be honest, and that's largely what the article I quoted argues. If China is able to continue to grow their economy to a point where they dwarf the United States and other countries, if they're at the forefront of cyber advancement or artificial intelligence, countries will have to come to China, and as long as China is capable of turning this economical power into geopolitical power, then they will effectively be able to take over the world in that way. Basically, becoming the center of the world and making it so that that other countries are so reliant on their trade and their supplies that it would be impossible to go against their will. All of this being said, a Great World War III is unlikely if China was to play their cards properly and take over the world in the ways I suggested. Now, if the first scenario was to happen, then it would be very possible one day the Chinese would assert military dominance over other countries and slowly take over them over a span of decades. However, if the second option happened, then they might not ever do this, but through their sheer economical dominance, other countries would be forced to change and morph themselves to live in a China-governed world, basically meaning that they took them over anyways. So, if all of these things happen, how would that affect us? Well, China is currently run by the Chinese Communist Party, who has been ruling over China for decades. This party is in complete control of everything that goes on in China, from the military to the police to all of the government. It's also said that this party has a very strong hold on the media in China and what is regularly fed to the people. Articles and news pieces slamming the government aren't typically tolerated in China at all. It's also said that if you want to have any major career advancement, publicly supporting the government is a must. Any opposition to this will risk persecution by this government. The Chinese Communist Party runs everything and is capable of controlling the public and maintaining order by feeding them exactly what they want to from the media. Therefore, if China truly was to rule the world, or at least had such a chokehold on other countries that they had to rely on China to survive, then videos such as the one I'm doing right now wouldn't be allowed. Complete freedom of speech would kind of go by the wayside, and everything that you say would be consistently monitored. Also, even if I did post a video like this, you most likely wouldn't ever see it, because unless I'm overwhelmingly praising the choices of the government, this video would be banned and wouldn't see the light of day. I also want to hammer that point home about being monitored. Right now, there are high-resolution cameras on every single corner of every single Beijing street. Also, everyone's online activity is consistently surveyed by the government. If China was to take over the whole world, then this level of surveillance would expand worldwide, and everything you say and do in your regular life would have to be censored. This is because anything you say or do, that could be brought back to you at a later time and used against you. The day-to-day life might not be super great either if China was to take over. China currently claims to have alleviated poverty from their nation, a problem that they were dealing with for decades. However, these reports have met harsh speculation, with most people believing the truth to be somewhere around a quarter of China's population is in poverty. Now, if China was to become the center of the world, I guarantee their economy would shift dramatically, and these statistics, they might not hold true anymore. But if they did, then it's very possible you or I wouldn't make a living wage. That's certainly a scary thought, especially because speaking out about it, that would be forbidden. I also want to quickly touch on language and culture. I would imagine that we all wouldn't immediately shift to speaking Mandarin, however, learning it as a second language would most likely become a must and forced by the Chinese government. Chinese-made film and art and literature would also be pushed far more and studied by the public. With all of that being said, if China took over the world, life would change dramatically. So much so that it's hard to fully cover in a 10-minute video. However, if it was to happen, then I don't think it would be for at least decades and potentially even centuries. I also don't think it would be a sudden shift either. If China was to take over the whole world, this would be a long, drawn-out process no matter which route they chose to go. I don't think that nuclear weapons would ever become involved, and I also think it's very likely that an organized war wouldn't take place either. If it did take place, then I think it would be a last-ditch effort from potentially the United States to stop China's global domination from advancing any further. If they were to take over the entire planet, then it probably would be through the economy, and it probably would resemble the Cold War a lot more than any other big battle we've seen in our time. Again, I cannot stress enough how a topic like this is hard to fully break down in 10 minutes, and I also want to note that if something like this was to take place, there are so many millions of variables in play that truly understanding what life would be like if China ran the world, it's almost impossible. But that doesn't stop us from being able to speculate, and with that, I would love to hear what you guys think on the topic. Hit me with some comments on what you think would happen if China took over the world. How would they do it? When would they do it? And what would life be like if they did?